Yo, don't get comfy yet, because tonight we're diving into a medieval nightmare. The food, not the royal feasts, not the turkey legs. We're talking what normal people actually ate. And honestly, it was horrifying. Bread full of grit. Rotten meat boiled in sadness. Water that sent you straight to the afterlife. And spices? Bro, if you weren't rich, you didn't even know what flavour was. They ate bark, boiled grass, and in famines, things got so dark we can't even say it out loud before bed. So before we bite into this historical train wreck, drop your location plus time in the comments. Let's see how many night owls are watching this medieval misery together. And if this video makes you even slightly thankful for your microwave, your fridge, or that weird half-eaten snack next to you right now, tap like, maybe subscribe, or just vibe. That's more than enough. Now, dim the lights, snuggle in, and prepare for the worst dinner in history. This is why food sucked in medieval times. Imagine you're waking up in a small, cold, smoky hut in northern Europe. It's the year 1315. You've slept on a straw mattress that smelled vaguely of mould, and you're already hungry. But that's normal. You're always hungry. You get up and reach for what you have. Bread. Maybe a crust from the day before, maybe something freshly baked by your wife or mother. It's dense, coarse, dark. You chew it slowly, and you don't expect much. It fills your stomach, and that's all it's meant to do. But what you don't know is that your bread might just drive you mad. In the Middle Ages, bread wasn't just food. It was survival. It made up as much as 3/4 of the calories peasants consumed. And for most poor villagers, that bread wasn't made of soft, white wheat. It was made of rye. Rye was easy to grow. It survived cold, wet seasons. It did well in poor soil. It was the grain of the people. But rye had a secret, a fungus called ergot. It grew on the grain, especially in wet years, and it didn't look particularly alarming. Just a darker speck here and there, a dusty spot. In a time when most people couldn't read, couldn't write, and certainly didn't know anything about microbes or mycotoxins, mouldy grain wasn't necessarily a red flag. It was food. It was what you had. And so people baked their bread. They shared it with their families. They fed it to their children. They fed it to the old, the sick, the hungry. And then the symptoms started. At first it was numbness in the fingers, then burning sensations, sharp pain, strange hallucinations. Some thought their limbs were on fire. Others saw visions of demons or angels or monsters crawling from the walls. Some lost control of their muscles, falling into spasms and fits. It wasn't long before people started calling it something terrifying, St. Anthony's fire. And that name stuck. Villages were stricken by waves of madness. Some people went blind, some wandered off and were never seen again. Others died slowly, painfully, their fingers or toes rotting from the inside out. And no one really understood what was happening. Was it the wrath of God, a curse, punishment for sin? Maybe the baker had done something wrong, or maybe the old woman in the next cottage, the one who always mumbled under her breath. Maybe she was a witch. Maybe she had cursed the village. In a world where every misfortune had a moral explanation, people were desperate for someone, or something, to blame. But the bread kept coming. It had to. There were no alternatives. Wheat was too expensive, oats were for animals, and famine was always one bad season away. In 1315, the rain started early. The weather turned cold. Crops failed across Europe. What little grain was harvested often came already infected. And the people, desperate, starving, ate it anyway. That was the beginning of the Great Famine. It lasted for 2 years. Millions went hungry. Some reports whispered of cannibalism, others of parents abandoning children. It was a time of darkness, dampness, and despair. And through it all, bread remained on the table, even if it came with madness baked in. Some people tried to stretch their grain supplies by adding things to the dough. Tree bark, crushed peas, even powdered roots. But these substitutions made the bread hard, bitter, and often even more dangerous. In towns and cities, bakers were sometimes punished for selling underweight or spoiled loaves. But out in the countryside, no one was watching. There was no law to protect you from your next meal. And yet bread was more than just food. It was sacred. It symbolized the body of Christ. To eat bread was to be part of something holy. And when that bread turned against you, people felt that too. It wasn't just a spoiled crop, it was a spiritual crisis. Monasteries offered prayers. Pilgrims walked for days to ask saints for healing. St. Anthony, the one the disease was named for, had an order of monks dedicated to helping those who suffered, but there were too many, far too many. And while the holy men prayed, the peasants kept baking. Women, especially, bore the weight of this burden. In most homes, it was the women who milled the grain, mixed the dough, and watched over the hearth. If the bread turned out bad, if it made someone sick, who else would people blame? Rumours turned into accusations. Accusations turned into trials, sometimes worse. Still, you had no choice. Your belly didn't care about fungal spores. Your children were crying. The only thing in the pantry was rye flour, blackened at the edges. So you mixed it with water, maybe some old beans, and you baked. And you hoped. Maybe this loaf wouldn't bring the fire. Maybe this time you'd be spared. And so day after day, year after year, people fed themselves with something they knew might kill them. But there were no alternatives. No science, no safety net, just bread. Dark, bitter, possibly poisoned bread. And somehow, through famine, plague and madness, life went on. But what kind of society survives when its very food supply might destroy the mind? Let's stay with you for a while longer. You're still in that cold little cottage. The rain hasn't stopped for weeks now. Your boots are wet. The firewood is nearly gone. And your stomach is making the kind of noise that keeps you up at night. The last loaf you baked, it was strange. The dough felt wrong, clammy, too dark even for rye. But you baked it anyway. You had to. And now your youngest son won't stop crying. He says his legs hurt. He says he can't feel his hands. The community whispers begin. It's not just your child. Others are getting sick. The old man near the chapel had a seizure yesterday. A young woman collapsed while carrying water, said she saw her dead brother in the forest just before she fainted. A man in the next village hacked off 3 fingers, saying the devil lived in them. It's all happening again. People start praying more and blaming more. This isn't just hunger anymore. This is fear. When the bread is bad, nothing is safe, not your sleep, not your sanity, not your place in the community. And the scariest part? There's no way to be sure if the loaf you eat today will keep you going or take you down. There are no signs on the outside, no rotten smell, no mould you can recognise. Just a quiet invasion inside the grain, baked and steaming on your table. As more people fall ill, suspicion starts to rise. Maybe someone's sabotaging the flour. Maybe that new miller brought in cursed seed from another parish. Maybe someone has sinned so terribly that the whole village is paying the price. Superstition is a way of understanding the chaos. It fills the silence left by the lack of knowledge. And when superstition is the only guide, justice becomes fear in a different costume. Witches, curses, demons. All it takes is one accusation, and all of a sudden, the woman who baked her bread in secret, or the family that still has flour while everyone else is starving, becomes a target. And in an era with no true medical explanation for disease, food poisoning, or hallucinations, communities often turned on themselves. But let's look further out, beyond your tiny village. Across Europe, famine is digging its claws into every country. Grain stores are shrinking, prices are doubling, even tripling. For the wealthy, that means inconvenience. For the poor, it's the difference between life and death. Entire caravans of traders are robbed, not for gold, but for sacks of mouldy barley. People begin eating anything: boiled weeds, leather, sawdust soaked in broth, animal feed, and of course bread, always bread, scraped together from whatever flour substitute they can manage. The rulers and priests try to intervene. In England, France, and parts of the Holy Roman Empire, councils are called. Food laws are drafted. Bakers are ordered to use only clean flour, but there's hardly any left to use. Enforcement is rare and usually only in towns. In rural areas, you're on your own. Even monasteries, those ancient centres of charity and learning, can only do so much. They offer thin porridge, a bit of cheese, a bit of bread, if they have any to spare. But they're suffering too. Some abbots write of monks dying in their cells, fasting not out of piety, but because they don't want to take the last of the supplies. One chronicler, writing in Flanders during this period, describes how people feared the morning meal more than the night terrors. Why? Because by day, you had to eat, and what you ate might make you sick. But starvation was worse. It was a cruel balance, a bitter choice, and it was made every single day. Millers too became figures of suspicion. They controlled the grinding, they handled the raw grain. If the flour was bad, it must be the miller's fault. In some regions, angry peasants rioted against the local mills, setting them on fire or seizing the stores of flour by force. This wasn't just food, it was power, it was life, held in the rough wooden boards of a creaky windmill. And when people couldn't find real flour, they made do with mock bread. You take ground peas, a handful of hay, a few shavings of tree bark, you mix it into something vaguely dough-like. You bake it if you still have firewood, and you try to eat it. The smell is awful, the texture is worse. It sticks to your teeth and tastes like ashes, but it's warm, and you don't want to die. So you eat it again the next day. There's no poetry in this survival. It's just desperation, and repetition, and praying that your next meal won't betray you. In some areas, rumours spread of rich households having white bread, fine wheat loaves baked with butter and honey, served beside cured meats and fresh wine. These were fantasies for most, but they stirred anger. Hunger creates more than physical pain. It creates envy, it breaks communities. It makes people believe the worst about each other. The famine slowly drags on. People try to plant new crops, but the rain won't stop. The roads are mud. The fields are waterlogged. Horses and oxen die from disease. Some parents sell their children, hoping a monastery or town will feed them. Others abandon the elderly in the woods. And through it all, people keep baking. Because they must. Because there's nothing else. Years later, some survivors will remember those days as a fog. Others will remember the faces of the dead. But nearly all will remember the bread. The heavy, bitter, fear-soaked bread that carried them through hell and nearly broke their minds. But what happened when people finally did stop trusting bread? The famine eventually ended. Not with a bang, not even with celebration, but with a slow, quiet change in the weather. Around 1318, the rains began to let up. The sun warmed the fields again. Seeds planted with little hope finally took root. But recovery didn't happen all at once. The people were different now. Thinner, wary, changed. And the bread, well, it wasn't trusted the way it once was. You survived. Maybe you lost a brother. Maybe your children no longer laughed the same way. Maybe you couldn't eat rye without thinking about the fire in your hands or the nights you saw shapes in the corner of your eyes. Your village was quieter now. There were fewer people at mass, fewer voices in the fields. Life had returned, but something sacred had gone missing. Something you couldn't quite name. The loaf, once a symbol of God's provision and stability, had become a thing of fear. People began grinding their own flour more carefully. They sifted, insected, stored grain differently. Some buried their flour to keep it cool. Others dried it in ovens before storing it, hoping to kill off anything inside. It wasn't science, not yet, but it was learned behaviour, and that was a start. Monasteries, still reeling from the burden of caring for the sick and starving, began writing down more about what they saw. Some monks even noted the blackened grain, the hallucinations, the pattern. Quietly, carefully, knowledge began to grow, but it would take centuries before anyone connected the dots to ergot. In towns, bakers' guilds became more powerful, not just to control business, but to set rules. Clean ovens, inspected sacks, training. In some places, these guilds introduced fines for spoiled bread. Some even held public demonstrations to show they were using pure flour. The trust had been broken. Now it had to be earned. And then came a new idea. Bread as politics. City councils started requiring bread for the poor. They built granaries, huge public storage buildings, to hold surplus grain for emergencies. These granaries were often locked, guarded, even blessed by priests. They became symbols of civic pride and preparation. No one wanted another 1315. Still, the memory lingered, in the folk songs, in the stories told to children. Bread was no longer just a comfort. It was a warning, a reminder of how fragile everything really was. And not just physically fragile, spiritually too. Because during those hard years, when people ate the bread and fell into madness, faith had been tested. Why would God allow his own symbol, his body in a sense, to become poison? Why had churches failed to protect the people? Why had the saints gone saint? Some said Hamilton's turned away from religion. Others clung to it harder than ever. Some blamed themselves. Others blamed strangers. The famine didn't just starve the body, it cracked the soul. And yet humanity didn't stop baking. In fact, over time, bread became safer. Millers learned better drying techniques. Grain rotation improved. People started combining grains, wheat with rye, barley with oats, to reduce risk. They learned, slowly, painfully, but they learned. Still, there's a strange echo of that fear in every loaf you break, every slice you butter, the trust you place in your food, how easily it can be lost, how slowly it returns. In some remote villages, stories were passed down for generations. A cursed crop, a loaf that made people dance until they died, a bakery that was burned to the ground after an entire family vanished. These were warnings, yes, but also memories, oral records of what happens when your only source of survival turns against you. Historians now believe that the events of the Great Famine and the bread crisis that accompanied it may have even helped set the stage for bigger changes. People began questioning the fairness of their systems. Lords who demanded grain while their peasants starved found themselves without workers. Some towns rebelled, some monasteries became more powerful, some withered into silence. Bread had become more than food. It was a reflection of justice, power, and care. When bread failed, everything else followed. And so the story ends, not with the eradication of ergo or a great discovery, but with small, careful adjustments. Better ovens, sharper eyes, public storage, less blind trust. But perhaps that's how most crises end. Not in grand revolutions, but in the quiet resolve of ordinary people who refuse to go mad again, who want their children to eat and sleep in peace, who want to believe once more that the bread is safe. So the next time you pull a loaf from the oven, warm and golden and harmless, maybe think of them, those who didn't know what they were baking, those who bit into darkness, those who saw the fire rise from the crust, and ask yourself, what do we trust today without even questioning it? Close your eyes for a moment and imagine the sound of the sea, not the tranquil rhythm of waves on a beach, but the constant groaning sway of a wooden ship creaking under the weight of barrels, cargo, and too many men packed into too little space. It's 1342, and you are sailing aboard a merchant vessel bound from the southern coast of England to a port in Flanders. You're not a captain, not a knight. You're just a deckhand, or perhaps a ship's cook, and your day begins not with sunlight, but with the smell of rot. Food on board is always the same: salted meat, dried peas, hard biscuit, a little beer if you're lucky, and that's if nothing's gone bad yet. You rise from your corner of damp rope and head to the storage deck where rows of barrels sit in the dark like squat, swollen tombs. You pry one open. Inside is beef, or at least it used to be. It's floating in a thick brine, salt water and thyme trying their best to keep the decay away. But you know the truth. You can smell it. The meat is turning. Still, it's all you have. You fish out the greyest chunk you can find and toss it into the pot. Maybe with enough boiling and a few herbs, if you have any left, it'll become edible. Maybe not. You stir it anyway. On a merchant ship, food isn't about flavour. It's about survival. Everything is salted. Beef, pork, even fish. Salt is the only thing keeping it from rotting. And it doesn't always work. The salt can clump or sink or simply run out. And when it fails, so do your bowels. You learn quickly to avoid the worst barrels, but choices are few. For the sailors, meals are a grim ritual. They sit in rows on the deck when the weather allows, slurping from bowls, chewing with tired jaws. No one talks much. Eating is work. You have to soften the biscuit in beer or water before it cracks a tooth. The peas, boiled into a mush, offer little comfort. And the meat, always the meat, tastes like shipwood and misery. Water is precious. Too precious to drink much. It's stored in barrels, but it goes foul fast. A few days out, it's already turning slimy, greenish. If you have beer, that's what you drink. It's weak, barely alcoholic, but it keeps better than water. When the beer runs out, and it always does, you pray for rain. You hold out your bowl and catch whatever the sky gives you, or you just drink the bad water and hope your stomach forgives you. The cook, if you can call him that, has no kitchen. He has a firebox, a small enclosed space where he can build a low flame. If the seas are calm, he boils. If they're not, he does nothing. Cold meals, cold meat, cold everything. Fires are dangerous aboard a wooden ship, so they're rare. Most of the time, food is just cold. Some of the men bring dried cheese or smoked fish from home. They guard these like treasure. A single onion can make you a friend. A dried apple, a king. You'd trade a knife for a lemon. You'd trade your boots for garlic. But these treats are rare, and once they're gone, it's back to the barrels. You try not to think about how long the meat's been in there. You try not to think about what part of the cow you just ate. You chew and you move on. Below deck, the smell never leaves. It's a mix of salt, mildew, sweat, and food gone wrong. Rats scurry, flies hover, moulds grow on wood. There are no windows, no air, just barrels and rope and dampness. If a cask leaks or bursts, you clean it fast. That much salt in the bilge water will ruin the ship's planks. And if you can't fix it, that meat is gone, and that means someone goes hungry. Sometimes you anchor for a night in a bay or a quiet port. If the captain is generous or desperate, you go ashore to buy fresh goods, eggs maybe, a chicken if luck is on your side, bread, real bread, the kind you haven't seen in weeks. You eat it all at once, you don't save it, because on a ship nothing keeps. And then the wind picks up again and the voyage continues. You're not a soldier, but you've heard of ships sailing to war with food even worse. Biscuit filled with weevils. Water so foul it's black. You count yourself lucky. You've only been sick once this trip, and you haven't lost a tooth. Yet. The days pass, the meat grows leaner, smaller. You start dreaming about onions, about stew, about wine and warm ovens. But when you wake, it's always the same. Hard biscuit, salted regret, and the groan of the sea. Still, something keeps you going. Maybe it's habit, maybe it's hope. Maybe it's just the knowledge that land eventually will come. But how many men have died with salted meat still on their tongues? The days blend together at sea. Sun, salt, wind, hunger. The ropes creak, the sails flap, and the sea is always moving, sometimes gently, sometimes like it wants to kill you. You eat the same thing every day in the same way, with the same tired faces around you. The salted meat is turning sour, the biscuit is hard as rock. The peas are mush, but not in a good way. You chew, you swallow, and you hope it stays down. Food storage on board a medieval ship wasn't clever. It wasn't efficient. It was just practical. Barely. Everything was packed in barrels, beef and pork mostly, salted heavily, stuffed in layer after layer. Some barrels weren't even sealed properly. If the wood warped or cracked, the saltwater brine could leak out and the meat would start to decay faster, and there was no backup. If a barrel went bad, it stayed bad. You didn't throw it out, you picked through it. You hoped the bottom half was still good. Some men tried to get creative. The cook might hang fish to dry from the rigging. If the weather was hot and dry, the fish would cure in the open air. If it was wet, the fish would rot before it dried. Either way, you ate it, because hunger doesn't leave room for pride. When supplies ran low, captains would ration the food. Smaller portions, longer waits. There were no clocks on board, just routines. You ate when the bell rang, you didn't ask questions. If you asked for more, someone else got less. Fights broke out sometimes, over a chunk of pork, a half cup of beer, a scrap of bread someone tried to hide in their coat. Food was power, everyone knew it. And then there were the maggots. Yes, the biscuits. Those hard, flour-packed ship's biscuits were famous for it. Weevils laid eggs inside the flour before it was even baked. By the time you bit into it, those eggs had hatched. You didn't always see them. Sometimes you did. Little white larvae wriggling in the cracks. Some sailors tapped their biscuits on the table first to shake the bugs out. Others didn't bother. They just ate. The bugs were protein, after all. Below deck, things were worse. The food storage area was dark and damp. Barrels sometimes leaked, and the smell of rotting meat would settle in the air like a fog. You had to rotate the barrels regularly, check the brine levels, shift things around to prevent mould from spreading. If you didn't, everything spoiled faster. And when someone got sick, and someone always did, it was hard to tell what caused it. Was it the meat, the water, the lack of fresh air, the mould in the biscuit? A simple fever could turn into something much worse. Diarrhea, vomiting, delirium. There were no doctors aboard, just guesses. Herbs, if anyone remembered which ones helped. And prayers. So many prayers. The cook sometimes tried to disguise the worst food. He'd boil the meat until it broke apart, then mash in peas, stale grain, maybe some dried herbs. He'd call it stew. It wasn't. But it was warm, and that mattered. A hot meal could lift spirits, even if it tasted like brine and regret. You'd sit on the deck, bowl in hand, staring out at the endless blue-grey of the sea. Maybe someone would hum a tune. Maybe someone would tell a story, probably one they made up, about roasted boar and honey cakes and a feast that never ended. Everyone would laugh, softly, and then they'd go back to chewing. Fresh food was rare, almost mythical. Sometimes a fishing line caught something, a cod, a herring. That was a celebration. The cook would gut it, grill it if he could, salt it if he couldn't. One fish for 20 men didn't go far, but it broke the monotony. It reminded you that the world had flavour somewhere. The lucky ships docked every few weeks. At port, the crew would resupply. They'd buy grain, dried beans, onions if they were in season, maybe even cheese. They'd restock barrels of meat, usually already salted. The new meat went on top. The old meat stayed below. No one ever threw anything out. The less lucky ships stayed at sea longer. If the weather was bad or the winds died, or pirates chased them off course, the journey could stretch on and on. Men wasted away. The food dwindled. Fights became more common. A barrel of salt pork might be all that stood between peace and mutiny. And when the voyage finally ended, if it ended, you stepped off the ship with a hollow stomach and a mouth that had forgotten how real food tasted. You'd walk into the nearest tavern, order whatever the cook had, and cry when the bread came out warm, soft, fresh, real. You'd eat with both hands, not caring who watched. You'd chew slowly like you were remembering something you forgot long ago. But you knew, deep down, that you'd go back to sea again, because money was there, or trade, or duty. And when you did, the barrels would be waiting, the salted meat, the hard biscuit, the foul water, and you'd start the cycle over again. But why didn't they find a better way to feed the men who carried the weight of the medieval world across the sea? By the time your boots hit land, if they still fit, your teeth are loose, your skin is pale, and your joints ache like you've aged 20 years. The ship is behind you now, creaking gently in the harbour, but the salt is still in your bones. You can still taste it. Everything tastes like it. The meat, the water, even your own mouth. Salt and rot all the way down. You don't realise it yet, but you've come back from a voyage not just with cargo, but with damage. Your joints swell because you haven't had enough vitamin C. Your gums bleed for the same reason. Your stomach groans every night because of the spoiled meat you swallowed and the water you drank from barrels slimed over with algae. You didn't complain. You couldn't. You had a job to do. But now, on dry land, the cost begins to show. Some men never return from sea, not because the ship sank or pirates attacked, but because food failed them. Their bodies gave out. Some died from scurvy, though no one knew the name for it yet. They just called it the wasting or the sailor's rot. Others simply stopped eating. When everything tastes like rope and vinegar, hunger starts to feel like mercy. There were no great nutritionists then. No doctors with tablets and powders, just guesswork, folk remedies. Some captains kept lemons or dried berries if they were wealthy, or had sailed through places where they were available. But most ships, salted pork and biscuit. That was the way. It was tradition. It was proven to keep you alive, barely. Over time, the sailors changed, not just their health, but their thinking. Some learned tricks, catch rain in tarps and strain it through linen, pick out the weevils from the biscuit before anyone saw you, chew slowly, let the food sit in your mouth until it's softened, pray over the barrels, not just because of superstition, but because sometimes it was the only thing that made swallowing possible. Some men began to smuggle their own supplies on board. Dried plums, fermented cabbage, anything they could tuck into a bundle of spare shirts. The cook might steal a little extra onion for the stew if he liked you. He kept your friends close, your rations closer. Back in port towns, people knew the signs. A sailor who walked stiffly with red cheeks and sunken eyes probably hadn't eaten fresh food in months. They'd give you pity or charge you double, sometimes both. Eventually word spread. Slowly, quietly. Captains started adding dried fruits. Lemons when they could get them. Salt gave way to vinegar in some barrels. And in the biggest ports, new laws began to take shape. Requirements for food supplies, quotas for beer, water, dry goods. But it was a slow shift. A painful one. Generations passed before real changes stuck. And even then, the men kept sailing. Because the sea doesn't wait. Trade didn't stop for hunger, Empires didn't care if your stomach was empty. The salted meat remained, maybe a little better packed, maybe wrapped tighter, but still there, still waiting in the dark. And what about the cooks? The quiet, thankless souls who stirred the stew and cut the spoiled bits away and tried to feed 30 men with 20 portions. They were rarely praised. No monuments stand for them. But without them, ships would have starved before they sailed half a league. They were not chefs, they were survivalists, and they fed the world one salted, steaming pot at a time. There are no recipes from those ships. No cookbooks passed down, just memories, smells, scars. The legacy of food at sea isn't delicious, it isn't grand, it's tired, it's practical, it's full of compromise and sacrifice. It's the reason empires grew and why some men never came home. So next time you unwrap a sandwich, fresh and soft and safe, remember the men who dined on meat so hard it splintered, water so foul it frothed, and biscuit so full of insects it moved, and ask yourself, how much comfort is built on the quiet suffering of those who came before? Wake up. It's not morning because you want it to be. It's morning because the light has hit your face and you have to get to the fields. You're a serf, tied to the land. You don't own it. You don't leave it. You work it. And for that your Lord lets you live, barely. Your stomach growls before your eyes even open. That's normal. It growls every morning. You slept in your clothes. There's no pillow, just a sack stuffed with straw. Your breath fogs the air, even indoors. The fire went out long ago, and your wife is already up, stirring something in the pot, something that's probably the same thing she made yesterday, and the day before that, and the day before that. Pottage, that's what you eat every day, for every meal. It's not soup, it's not stew, it's somewhere in between. A thin, warm mixture of whatever grain you have, usually oats or barley, mixed with water, and maybe a few scraps of onion, leek, cabbage or turnip if you're lucky. If you're very lucky, there's a bone in it. Not meat, just the bone, something to give it flavour. If the bone's been boiled a dozen times already, well, it's still a bone, still flavour. There's no salt, that's expensive. There's no pepper, that's imported. There's no butter, unless it's spring and the cow didn't dry up. There's no choice. You eat pottage because there's nothing else. Beside the pot, there's a hunk of coarse brown bread. It's dense. It's dry. It's full of bran, sometimes bark, sometimes bean flour. It's dark not because it's whole grain, but because that's the sweepings off the mill floor. The good flour goes to the manor house. You get what's left. Still, you tear off a piece and dunk it in the pottage. It softens. You chew. You swallow. You eat quickly because work waits. You don't savour, you consume, and you wash it down. Not with water, which might be foul, but with ale, weak ale, small ale, brewed at home with whatever barley was left from the last harvest. It's cloudy, sour, barely alcoholic, but it's safe. It won't give you worms or send you to the latrine every hour. Not like the stream water will. The kids get ale too. Even the little ones. It's normal. No one questions it. You don't drink to get drunk. You drink because it keeps you alive. You carry a small bit of food with you to the fields, a piece of bread, maybe a few beans. That's your midday meal. You eat it on a rock with dirt on your hands, sweat dripping into your collar. There's no lunch break, just a pause, and then back to the plough. Dinner is more of the same. Pottage, bread, maybe an egg if the hen laid one, maybe some dried peas or lentils stirred into the pot. If it's winter, it might be turnips every day for a week. If it's spring, wild greens, bitter ones. You boil them 3 times to make them edible. Sometimes, someone traps a rabbit. It's not legal, technically. It belongs to the Lord's land. But hunger has no rules, so you skin it, cook it fast, and bury the bones deep. If you get caught, you could be fined, or worse. But if no one sees, it's a feast. You don't eat cows, they're worth too much. You don't eat chickens often. You need the eggs. You don't eat pigs unless one dies suddenly. And when one does, it's a blessing. The entire village might come together for it. Salting, smoking, sharing. But that's rare. Most days it's pottage. Again. You grow what you can. Patch of onions, some leeks, a few beans, a cabbage or two. Everything depends on the weather. If there's too much rain, things rot. If there's too little, they wither. If they grow, you eat. If not, you starve. The manorial system doesn't care. You owe a portion of everything you grow to your lord, even if the crop failed, even if your child is sick, even if your thatch leaks. You give the grain, you give the eggs, you give the best of what little you have, and then you survive on what remains. You've heard of things like cheese, sausages, honey, spices. You've maybe smelled them at a market, maybe seen the noble servants carrying baskets filled with them. But those aren't for you. You're not a person who tastes things. You're a person who endures them. Still, there's rhythm in it. Comfort even. The pot is warm. The bread is filling, even if it's rough. The ale eases the evening. You sit near the hearth with your family. You listen to the wind. You watch the fire. You eat what you have. And you wonder, what would it be like to taste something sweet, something tender, something different? But tomorrow it'll be pottage again. You start to notice it in the joints first. The way your knees don't bend as easily. The stiffness in your back that doesn't go away after rest. You're not old, maybe 30, maybe less. But your body feels older. That's what pottage does to a person. That's what bread without meat, greens without fruit, and ale without variety will do over the years. Malnutrition isn't sudden, it sneaks up, quietly. You don't collapse in the fields, you just start to ache more, heal slower, catch colds more easily, and when the seasons turn and your vegetables don't grow or your cow doesn't calve, it gets worse. You can't name the illnesses, no one can. No one has a word for anemia or scurvy. But you see it. Pale faces, swollen gums, children with thin arms and bloated bellies, a neighbour who hasn't walked in days, a grandmother who never got out of bed again. When disease comes, and it always does, it spreads fast. Coughs turn into fevers, fevers turn into funerals. You don't know why. You don't know how to stop it. You just keep boiling the pot. Keep feeding the sick whatever is warm. Keep praying that your family won't be next. Some say garlic helps, or leeks. Some put herbs under pillows. Others burn rosemary or wear little pouches of sage and mint around their necks. Folk wisdom, church teachings, instinct. Anything that gives a sense of control. Sometimes the priest says it's God's punishment. That sin has brought sickness. That fasting is holy. But fasting isn't a spiritual choice when your grain bin is empty. It's just what's happening. And through it all pottage, always pottage. The recipe never changes. You boil water, add grain, stir in whatever you've got. Onions? Great. Peas? Even better. Nothing? Then just water and oats. You boil it longer to soften it. You eat it slowly to make it last. Some women get creative. They shape pottage into small cakes and fry them on a hot stone if there's a bit of fat left over from a pig slaughter. That's a treat. Fried food is rare. Most meals are boiled because boiling is efficient. It's safe. And it keeps the food from burning. You've eaten the same thing for weeks, months, years. You don't complain. It's just life. Sometimes the mind stops wanting variety. You stop dreaming of roasted meat or buttery pastries. You start dreaming of enough. A full bowl, a second piece of bread, a spoonful of dried apple tucked into the edge of a meal. You help your children finish their share first. That's what a parent does. You learn to stretch it. You learn to skip seconds. You learn to listen for the wind, because if a storm ruins your barley crop, next season's pottage will be even thinner. Community helps. When someone's crop fails, others share what they can. Not because they have extra, but because they know next year it might be them. You trade what you can, eggs for onions, milk for dried beans, a bit of wool for a few pieces of bread. And then there are the hunger years. They come like ghosts. Maybe it's too much rain, maybe a late frost, maybe disease in the livestock. Suddenly the meals get smaller, the pot gets thinner. You skip lunch, the children cry at night. You feel it in your bones, not just hunger but fear. The worst years don't kill fast. They grind people down slowly. Neighbours shrink, children don't grow. A baby is born too weak to nurse, and the pottage keeps boiling. Every day someone stirs it. Every day someone eats. Even if it's just hot water and memory. The seasons change, the rhythms continue. You plant, you reap, you store, you give to your Lord, you keep what's left, you hope it's enough. And when you lift that wooden spoon again, feel the steam on your face, you say a quiet prayer, not for something better, but for enough to make it through winter. But how long can a life survive when the same thin meal is all it ever knows? The years pass. You've eaten from the same bowl for decades now. It's chipped along the rim, stained, but still whole, just like you. You've raised children on pottage, watched them slurp at the same hearth where you once did. You've taught them how to stretch flour, how to scrape the crust from the pot, how to brew ale from the dregs. Not because you wanted to, but because you had to. This is life, and this is food. Your hands are rough now, cracked, scarred from years in the field and near the fire, but they still stir, still slice turnips in winter, still knead dough when the barley comes in thick. You still listen to the pot bubble, still breathe in the scent of something warm. Not delicious, not exciting, but warm, and that's enough. You no longer dream of rich meals. You've stopped caring what the nobles eat. They're far away. Their meats and pastries might as well be stories. You care about the next harvest, about the onions in the ground, about whether your cow will survive the frost. That's your wealth. Not gold, not grain stores, but another season of enough. Yet sometimes you visit the church not just to pray, but to read the notices. The Lord's men post new laws about hunting, about grain, about taxes. The church posts fasting days, saints' feasts, days when meat is forbidden, as if meat ever touches your table anyway. You smile when they mention abstinence, because for your family it's just called Tuesday. The priest gives sermons on gluttony. You sit in the back and listen, not because you disagree, but because you've never had the chance to be a glutton. You wonder if the priest has ever eaten pottage for 30 straight days. But you don't complain. You never did. Complaining doesn't sow fields or fill bellies. You take what you have and you stretch it. That's what everyone does. That's how your grandmother lived. That's how her mother lived. That's how your children will live too. The meals change a little with the years. Sometimes someone marries into a new family and brings a trick. How to store beans so they don't mould, how to dry herbs for the winter. Sometimes a new vegetable appears from the market. You taste it. You learn to cook it. Then it becomes part of the rotation. Nothing fancy, just something else to stir into the pot. Then one winter your leg doesn't heal right. You sit near the fire more. The children bring you food now. They've learned well. The pottage is still thin but not flavourless. There's sage in it, maybe garlic. You taste effort, care, continuity. And when you close your eyes one final time, the fire still crackles, the bowl is still warm, and the spoon is still in reach. You were never famous, never written about, but you fed a family, kept a house warm, worked a field, and stirred the same meal until it gave strength to others. That's not nothing. History remembers kings, it remembers wars and castles and treaties, but the world was built by hands like yours. Gritty, calloused, steady, stirring pottage, brewing ale, passing on what little knowledge there was. And now, centuries later, the recipe still echoes. Not on royal scrolls or in gilded books, but in the smell of boiling grain, in the scrape of a wooden spoon, in the shared silence around a simple steaming pot. So next time you feel tired of leftovers, of repetition, of the small rhythms of daily life, remember those who never had the chance to choose anything different. And ask yourself, is it really so boring to eat the same thing every day, if it means you get to eat it all? Picture a grand stone manor, the kind with high walls, draughty halls, and a dining hall large enough to echo every spoon drop. It's early morning, the servants are already busy, fires are being stoked, water hauled in heavy pails, and deep in the heart of the building the kitchen comes alive, not with joy but with labour, endless, thankless labour. Now picture yourself not at the noble's table, but standing barefoot near the oven, apron soaked from yesterday's stew, elbow deep in flour that was sifted to remove the insects. You're not a cook by trade. You were born into this role. Maybe your mother stirred these same pots. Maybe her mother before her. The kitchen isn't a place of creativity. It's a battlefield. Not for glory, but for survival, for order, for status. Because even in a kitchen, especially in a kitchen, everyone has a place. At the top is the master cook, sometimes trained in a noble household, sometimes brought in from abroad. He wears clean sleeves, he manages the menus, he decides who eats what and when, but he doesn't wash pans, He doesn't skin rabbits. That work falls to the lower hands. The scullery maids, the turnspits, the spit boy, the dishwiper. Job lower than the last. And the food? It mirrors this same pecking order. The lord of the manor dines on roasted game, swan sometimes, or peacock with its feathers stitched back on for flair. He eats meat wrapped in pastry, fish stuffed with herbs, eggs boiled in wine, and sauces thickened with almonds and brightened with saffron, imported, expensive saffron. Spices come in pouches locked away into the buttery. Pepper, cinnamon, nutmeg, cloves, ginger, each worth more than their weight in silver. Not used for flavour alone, but for display. The noble doesn't just want his meal to taste good, he wants it to show his wealth. He wants guests to smell prestige, and spices, rare and golden, do exactly that. Meanwhile, the household staff eats the scraps, literally. The second cut of meat, the leftover porridge, the crust from the pie after the top has been served. Sometimes you're lucky, and the cook lets you skim the top of the stew pot, the bit with real flavour. But mostly you eat what wasn't wanted. There's no cinnamon in your bowl, no nutmeg in your lentils. If you're a maid, you may sneak a lick from the spoon when no one's watching. You may dream of what the roasted duck tastes like, but you won't find out. Not really. Down the lane in the village, things are even grimmer. The peasants can't even smell the lord's spices. They cook with leeks, onions, and wild herbs. Parsley, sage if they're lucky. For flavour they might use mustard seed or a bit of garlic. But real imported spices? Out of the question. And bread, the basic unit of medieval food, follows the same pattern. The lord gets the white loaf, fine wheat, sifted and baked by the skilled hands. The servants get rye or barley, coarser, heavier, sometimes a blend. The peasants get what's left, oat cakes, bean bread, sometimes stretched with sawdust or ground up tree bark in famine years. Even cheese has a hierarchy. Fresh, soft cheese for the table, hard, dry rind for the staff, scraps of curd or spoiled lumps, those are mixed into pottage down in the village. In this world, even waste has a structure. The bones from the feast go to the kitchen staff to boil. The grease scraped from roasting pans might be saved, clarified and sold. Nothing is thrown out, but everything is filtered through status first. And the rot? The mould? That belongs to the poor. Literally. In cities, bakers often reused old bread to make new batches. If the flour was bad, if the dough went sour, they still sold it, cheap. People who couldn't afford fresh bread bought it stale. If it was too stale, they soaked it. If it was mouldy, they scraped it. And they ate it anyway. Markets in town sometimes sold scrap pies, baked from leftover meat, questionable poultry and offal bits. These were sold to workers, servants, apprentices. You didn't ask what was inside, you just hoped it was still edible. But back in the manor, the lord's food is another world. A world of gold leaf on pastries. Almond milk poured over rice, sugar sculptures, moulded by hand. Decorative jellies dyed with beetroot or herbs. The noble's kitchen isn't just feeding people, it's performing power. And every time you turn the spit or pour the wine or kneel to scrub the pots, you know it. You smell the spices but don't taste them. You plate the duck but eat the beans. You ladle the stew but never get the top layer. And you wonder, how can the same kitchen feed one man a feast and another just fumes? The kitchen is hotter now. The hearth roars, the pot bubbles, and the air is thick with the scent of meat you'll never taste. Roasted goose with rosemary, a sauce of crushed almonds and raisins spiced with cinnamon and ginger. You stir the pot with your eyes half closed, not because you're tired, though you are, but because it helps to imagine just for a moment that the food is yours. It isn't. You're back in your place. The back corner of the kitchen, one of 10, maybe 20 servants working under the master cook. Everyone has a job. Someone trims herbs, someone skins eels, someone stirs, someone watches the spit. The boy who turns the spit all day long, he's practically part of the machinery. The fire never stops, neither does he. And behind the kitchen, the pantry, locked. The buttery, locked. The spice cabinet, triple locked. The keys are held by the steward. You don't touch anything without permission. Spices are wealth. They travel farther than most people ever will, from ships in the east, through ports and traders, past tolls and thieves, to land in your lord's cupboard, inside a polished wooden box that smells richer than any stew you've ever eaten. But while spices are rare and precious, mould is not. If you're poor, mould finds you. Cheese hardens and cracks, bread blooms green, apples rot from the inside out. You cut around it when you can, you scrape it off when you can't. Most days you just eat it. Because food is food, and rot is just part of life. There are no cold cellars for preservation in your cottage, no ice houses, no dry larders with thick stone walls. You hang things in the rafters, store things under the floor, bury them if you're desperate. And still, the mice get in. The damp creeps through. The mould comes anyway. Meanwhile, the noble's kitchen has preservation methods you can only dream of. Smoked meats hung high, salted fish packed tight in barrels, dried fruit rolled in honey and sealed in clay jars. They preserve with sugar, vinegar, spices. All expensive, all guarded, all unavailable to you. You've seen the waste though, scraps from the table, bread crusts, bones, bits of fat carried out to the servants, or, if the Lord is generous, to the poor at the gate. This is how the village sometimes eats, on the leftovers of the leftovers. Cold stew ladled over stale bread. Better than nothing, but not by much. When you're down in the village, food is communal, not in a romantic sense, but out of necessity. You trade, you borrow, you share a single onion among 3 families. You dry herbs in the window and pray no storm takes them. You make butter once a week if the cow cooperates. You bake bread in a shared oven if the firewood lasts. But the hierarchy never fades. A noble meal might take hours, multiple courses, fish, then fowl, then meat, then pies, then sweets, a table crowded with trenchers, thick slabs of bread used as plates soaked with sauce, tossed aside afterward or given to the dogs. You eat from a clay bowl, with a wooden spoon. If you have a second spoon, it's for guests. If not, you share. You hear talk of people who can afford to fast for religious reasons, not because they must, but because they choose to. That kind of choice is unimaginable. You fast because the barley didn't grow, because the hen stopped laying, because your neighbour's flour barrel ran out, and yours never filled to begin with. And still the rich dine in painted halls. They eat decorated food. They entertain guests with edible symbols, red jellies for courage, green sauces for freshness, gold leaf-topped custards for wealth. Every dish says something about them, about their power, their knowledge, their place. You eat to not die. Even within kitchens, this plays out. The higher servants may get bits of better meat. The closer you are to the dining room, the closer you are to the good scraps. The rest eat boiled beans, leftover broth, occasionally a fish head. You learn not to expect more, but you always notice, and sometimes you wonder, what does cinnamon taste like when it's not just a smell on the air? The feast is over. You hear it in the clatter of dishes, the scrape of trenchers, the thud of empty cups hitting oak. The great hall is quieting down now. The nobles laugh softly in their seats, bellies full, oil lamps flickering against stone walls, their lips stained with wine, their fingers slick with gravy. And here you are, back in the kitchen, collecting what's left. A pie crust with the filling scooped out, a broken bit of custard, a sliver of salt pork someone didn't finish. You and the others gather them quickly, quietly. No one speaks of it as scavenging. It's just what you do. It's the closing ritual of the meal, for those who cooked it but didn't eat it. The bread is torn, the stew is gone. Someone managed to sneak a spoonful of honeyed carrots. You chew it slow, savouring the sweetness like a secret. And for a moment you remember why people care about food at all, because flavour means more than pleasure. In this world it means access, status, power. The Lord's spice box didn't just hold ingredients, it held identity. To own pepper was to signal connection to the world. To sprinkle cinnamon on your porridge was to announce that you mattered. Even if no one could see it, you knew. Food was more than food. It was theatre, symbol, language, A guest offered rare spices was being honoured. A traveller who brought cloves was welcomed with open arms. Recipes weren't passed down from mother to daughter as much as they were guarded by households, whispered by stewards, recorded by monks when they were recorded at all. Because in this time, knowing how to eat well was almost as valuable as having the food itself. In the villages, people shared simpler knowledge: how to boil nettles without the sting, how to turn spoiled milk into curd, how to smoke meat over a slow fire for winter. These were survival recipes, built on trial, error, and generations of watching pots that rarely changed. The cook in the manor might use saffron, cardamom, even sugar if the steward allowed it. But you learn to flavour with salt only when it's available, mustard when it's wild, vinegar if you're lucky. And most days you eat without flavour, without difference, without memory. The smell of roasting meat becomes a kind of music you don't dance to. The sight of pastries on silver trays, a dream seen through glass. They pass you by like carriages through the village, noticed but never touched. You think of how the rich feast on saints' days and holidays, on weddings and hunts. You wonder if they ever eat alone, if they ever sit quietly with a bowl of porridge and nothing else, if they ever chew in silence. And you wonder too, do they know how you eat? Have they ever tasted bean pottage left out overnight? Have they scraped mould off a loaf to feed their child? Have they eaten onion skins when the bulb was gone? They probably haven't, but their world depends on you, on your hands peeling root vegetables, on your fire that stays hot even when the snow falls, on your eyes that can tell when the stew will curdle. You are the engine of the kitchen, the flame behind the feast. And though you'll never sit at that table, your shadow is always there. Eventually the kitchen quiets too. The dishes are stacked, the fire banked. The air still smells faintly of cinnamon and duck fat. And your belly is half full, which is more than usual. You lie down on a mat in the corner, apron still on, and close your eyes. And you dream, not of riches, not of velvet chairs or golden spoons. You dream of a meal with flavour, a meal that belongs to you. Because in the end, it was never just about the spices or the mould. It was about who had the right to taste joy and who only got to sell it. You sit at the table, bowl in front of you, spoon in hand, but you don't eat. You haven't eaten all day. You won't eat until tomorrow, not because your pantry is empty, not this time, but because the church says today is a fast day. It's not just Lent, it's not just Friday, it's Wednesday, or maybe Saturday, or one of the vigils before a feast, or the eves of certain saints' days, or the 40 days before Christmas, which people forget about now. The calendar is heavy with fasting, and you're expected to follow. Not everyone fasts the same way. If you're a monk, your rules are strict. If you're a peasant, they're merely expected. But for everyone, food is not just nourishment, it's morality. Every bite you take is a decision. Every meal, a spiritual test. Church isn't just asking you to skip food, it's defining what counts as food in the first place. No meat, no fat, no animal byproducts, no warm-blooded creatures, sometimes no dairy, sometimes no eggs. Fish, that's usually allowed, but not the good kind, not the plump river trout or grilled eel with herbs. Just pickled herring, salted cod, maybe dried sardines if they survive the journey from the coast. So you sit and eat fish, not because you like it, but because it's not meat. And you chew bread without butter, because indulgence is sin. The idea isn't to make you suffer, but you suffer anyway. In the monasteries, meals are even bleaker. Monks eat in silence. One reads scripture aloud while the others chew slowly. Meat is banned. Meals are repetitive. Boiled beans, Lenten pottage, black bread. The richer the monastery, the more variety. Sometimes almonds, sometimes spiced wine, but always within the lines. The friars write manuals for fasting. They track days, foods, intentions. They debate whether otters count as fish. They argue about barnacle geese, migratory birds no one sees nesting. Are they fish too? Some say yes. Some say it doesn't matter. God knows your heart, but the rules stay. The poor don't always follow the rules perfectly, but they try. Because fasting isn't just about food, it's about social proof, public devotion. The Lord fasts in his hall, with servants bringing him dishes of rice and figs. You fast with cold bread and sour cabbage, but at least you're fasting. To eat meat when you shouldn't isn't just wrong, it's a sandal, a public sin. It can mean penance, fines, shame. If you're caught cooking meat on a holy day, you might be reported. If you serve it to others, you might be punished. Even smell becomes suspicious. And so people get clever. You boil bones quietly, you stew fish heads to mimic broth. You stuff pastries with dried fruit and call them holy pies. In some cities, bakers become experts in Lenten goods. Fake cheese made from almond milk, sausages shaped from seasoned grains. Still hunger lingers, because while the rich substitute, the poor simply go without. A fasting day might just mean water and a crust. A fasting week means dizziness, headaches, fatigue. But that's what makes it holy, isn't it? Your body denied, your will tested, your faith displayed. And as the church calendar rolls on, fasting becomes a rhythm, a familiar ache, something you learn to expect, to measure your year, not in feasts but in gaps between food. But what happens when a people who already live on the edge and are asked to eat even less? The fast continues. It's not just today, it's the whole season. Lent has begun. 40 days, not counting Sundays. 40 days of less. Of simpler meals, colder meals, quieter kitchens. You've adjusted, sort of. The body protests at first, then surrenders. You get used to hunger. It becomes a quiet companion. In some households, fasting brings new routines. The meat hooks hang empty. The butter jar is sealed. The fat is gone from the stew pot. You reach for oil instead, if you have it. If not, you boil things plain. In monasteries, fasting is written into the very rule of life. St. Benedict's rule demands moderation, humility, and self-control. Monks eat just once or twice a day in silence by candlelight. They weigh their bread, count their beans, fast not just with food, but with speech, comfort, warmth. Fasting is a doorway to heaven, they say. The less you eat, the more you listen. In cities, fasting becomes performative. Bakers advertise Lenten bread. Fishmongers make a fortune. Markets shift with the season. Meat stalls are boarded up and fish stalls overflow. Prices rise, salted fish becomes currency. Herring ships double their loads, monasteries order barrels of eels. Inns serve watery fish stew instead of mutton. The economy bends to the church calendar. Even food knows when it's holy time. But not everyone can afford to fast properly. The poor have no salted cod, no almond paste, no imported figs. Fasting for them is often indistinguishable from regular hunger. They can't replace meat with fancy fish or sweetened bean paste. They just stop eating what little they had. They fast because they must, and they hope that counts. Still, the church insists that fasting must be a choice to have value. You must intend it, you must understand its meaning. But for many, that meaning gets blurry when the cupboard's already bare. And then there's suspicion. What happens when someone doesn't fast? What happens when a neighbour's chimney smells like roasting meat on a Friday? In some villages, it's just a rumour, a glance, a whisper. In others, it's a scandal, a matter for the priest. People were brought before church courts for breaking fast rules. Fines were issued, confessions demanded, public penance assigned. Sometimes a fast-breaking meal was treated as a sign of greater sin, gluttony, greed, even heresy. Eating wrongly could become a sign of believing wrongly, and yet people broke the rules. Sometimes they were sick, sometimes pregnant, sometimes working so hard that a crust and water wasn't enough. Sometimes they just couldn't take it anymore. So they cooked quietly after dark behind closed shutters. They whispered grace instead of singing it. And in some homes, fasting was taken too far, not by the poor, but by the holy. Certain saints were known for extreme fasting. St. Catherine of Siena, who lived for weeks on nothing but the Eucharist. St. Francis, who claimed joy in hunger. These stories were held up as inspiration, but also warning, because not everyone who fasted did so with balance. Some slipped into illness, some into visions, some into death. The line between piety and harm was thin, and easy to cross when hunger blurred your thoughts. Still, the church held the fasts, and people followed. Because it wasn't just about food, it was about discipline, about aligning the body with the soul, about sacrifice, and about control. Fasting reinforced structure. Who obeyed, who didn't, who was holy, who needed correction. And so the calendar ruled the stomach. Feasting and fasting, meat and meatless, bread and ashes, the rhythm of hunger sanctified. But what does it mean when even your hunger isn't entirely your own? The fast is over, the bell rings, the tables are laid, and for one night the world tastes different. It's Easter now, or maybe Christmas, or a saint's feast that breaks the long cold of winter. Whatever the occasion, tonight you eat meat again. Tonight you taste fat. The bread is warm, the fire is strong, there is wine. Maybe a roast, maybe eggs dyed and baked into sweet loaves. You eat with your hands and close your eyes. And for a moment, the body forgets the ache of fasting, but it never forgets the rhythm. Because in the medieval world, fasting was more than calendar markings. It was a cycle of presence and absence, not just of food, but of feeling. You weren't just eating or not eating, you were learning about control, about identity, about obedience. The noble fasted with substitutions, fish dressed in sauces, spiced porridge instead of pork, almond milk and dried dates. His table was never truly bare, just rearranged. The monk fasted with discipline. Bread and beans, broth with no bone, hunger as a companion, silence as seasoning. His fast was intentional, measured, controlled. And the poor fasted because they were poor, because they had no choice, because fasting for them wasn't holy, it was daily life. And yet they bowed their heads, said the prayers, honoured the saints, not because it felt noble, but because it gave shape to the hunger, because it made the emptiness feel like part of something larger. Sometimes fasting brought clarity, sometimes it brought weakness, sometimes it just brought more hunger. But it was never just about food. Fasting was a tool, a structure, a form of submission, not just to God, but to the church, to the authority of calendars, to the weight of tradition. The people didn't fast because it felt good. They fasted because it felt expected, because it marked them as believers, as obedient, as part of something. And when the fast grew too frequent, when even Wednesdays became meatless and Fridays blurred into holy weeks, people learned to live in the gaps, to find flavour in leeks, to bake with pea flour, to make butter from almond milk. They became inventors of bland resilience. Food, even in absence, shaped identity. You knew who you were by what you ate or didn't eat, and that legacy never truly ended. Even now, echoes of those fasts remain. In holidays, in rituals, in the idea that self-denial is virtuous, that hunger can be holy, that food is not just fuel but a story, a symbol, a judgment. The medieval world may be gone, but the memory of the fast is still tucked quietly in the fold between our meals. So next time you skip a dish or choose less instead of more, whether for belief or balance or nothing at all, ask yourself, what hunger do we inherit without ever questioning why? The fire smokes more than it flames. You cough, wave the air and squat lower, squinting into the pot. It bubbles slowly, reluctantly. That's your dinner, the same as lunch, the same as yesterday. A mess of water, grain and whatever root or herb you manage to scrape from the edge of the frostbitten garden. You poke it with a stick. The heat's uneven. The stones beneath the pot are wet. The wood half rotted. Still, it's hot. It's edible. It's food. Welcome to dinner in the Dark Ages. You live in a one-room hut. No chimney, just a hole in the roof. The walls are wattle and daub, patched and repatched. The floor is dirt. The hearth is the heart of everything, not just for warmth, but for cooking, light, smoke control. And if your fire goes out, you're in trouble. Starting a new one is hard, time-consuming, and without it, no food. There is no oven, there is no pan, there is just one pot, clay or cast iron if you're lucky. And it almost never leaves the fire. So you boil. You boil because it's all you can do. You don't roast meat because you don't have any. And even if you did, roasting takes space, tools, turning spits, hooks, grease catchers. Those belong to manors and castles, not to you. Boiling is safer, easier, cheaper. It softens everything, even the things that probably shouldn't be eaten in the first place. Boiling doesn't need finesse, just time and fire and patience, a lot of patience. You toss in oats, maybe barley, maybe bits of dried bean if you have them, a leek, a turnip, the green top of a carrot that didn't grow right. In they go. The broth thickens, never deepens. It's not stock, it's more like survival in a bowl. No one talks about recipes here, just what's left. Dinner is not a planned event. It's what happens when enough scraps share heat for long enough. And seasoning, not likely. You might have salt if you're near a coast or if a trade cart passed through recently. You might find mustard seed or a bit of local herb, but you're not reaching for spices. Not in this world, not in this time. There are no cookbook, no menus, just trial and error, and repetition. Repetition so deep it becomes memory. You could boil blind and still make the same meal. Some days the pot never leaves the hearth. It just sits there, thickening and reducing until it becomes something like glue. You add more water, stir, eat, add more ingredients, stir again. The bottom browns. You scrape it. Call it crust. It's the closest thing to texture you'll get. Boiling isn't just the default, it's the only option. There's no firewood to waste on baking, no metal grates, no dried spices to fry, no idea what frying even is. In this world, the culinary arts are reduced to heat plus water plus hope. And yet people live, people eat. Children grow up slurping the same pottage every day. Old people sip broth with hands too shaky to hold a spoon. No one expects pleasure from food, only warmth and fullness. If your stomach stops growling and your hands stop shaking, the meal was a success. The pot becomes everything. Heirloom, tool, lifeline. Passed down, patched, protected. Because if it breaks, you break with it. Without it, there is no dinner, just cold roots and wet bread. But what does it do to a people when boiling becomes not just a method, but an entire way of life? The fire has been going all day. Not high, not fast, just steady. The pot hasn't left its place in the ashes. You stirred it in the morning, added more water at noon, and now it's dusk again. You drop in a new scrap, a sliver of root vegetable, a handful of wild greens. The liquid shifts, bubbles, accepts it without fuss. This is perpetual pottage, a meal that never ends, one you add to, remove from and feed from over and over. The Dark Ages didn't invent it, but they perfected it. Because when you only have one pot, one fire and not much else, you keep dinner going like a candle flame, just enough to warm, never enough to impress. You ladle it out slowly, carefully, there's no measurement, no portion control, just memory. You give the children more. You take less for yourself. The elders get the softest pieces, the strongest get what's left. Hunger isn't just about need, it's about roles. There's no concept of courses, no appetizer, no dessert, just one bowl, one spoon, one chance to feel warm before sleep. And you don't expect variety. This week it's turnip heavy. Last week it was mostly oats. You remember the spring it tasted green, too much wild garlic, maybe nettle. The summer it went sour, when someone dropped spoiled cabbage in and didn't say a word. But you ate it anyway, because boiling made things safe. It softened tough roots. It hid smells. It made old things tolerable. It made bad things possible. And that's what mattered. Boiling's democratic. It doesn't care about texture or timing. You don't need skill, just patience and fuel and something, anything to boil. Bones, beans, barley, weeds from the field, crusts soaked in water. You learn what works, you remember what doesn't. Even meat, when it appears, is boiled. Roasting is a luxury, a display of power. Only the wealthy wasted heat to crisp a duck. You drop it in the pot, let the fat rise, skim it if you're clever. Share the broth, chew the stringy meat. There are no kitchens, just hearths. No recipes, just stories. No tools, just hands. Your grandmother boiled her dinner in this same way. Your children will too. If you're lucky, you pass on a trick or two. How to boil lentils without splitting them. How to use ash as a cleaner for your pot. How to store broth overnight so it doesn't spoil. There's wisdom in this repetition. But no one calls it that. No one romanticizes the pot. No one marvels at the layers of flavour. They eat, they sigh, they work, they sleep, and some don't wake up. Illnesses come and go, some are from water, some from rot, some from weakness the pot couldn't prevent. But still it boils, day after day, like a quiet promise that tomorrow will taste mostly the same. Sometimes someone adds something different. A crushed nut, a bit of dried fruit. The whole family notices. Someone asks where it came from. Someone else says, don't waste it. Everyone chews slower. The flavour vanishes, but the memory lingers. The pot returns to normal. In some villages, the pot is the centre of the home. It decides when the family eats, when they gather, when they speak, when they rest. It marks time. It replaces clocks. The past is a blur of boiled things, the future, more of the same. You stop wishing for new flavours. You start appreciating the familiar ones. The way oats taste when they burn a little. The smell of parsnip. The way broth turns creamy after too many beans. You find meaning in minor shifts. Because in the Dark Ages, survival isn't innovation. It's heat and water and a pot that never quite empties. But how much of a culture's imagination disappears when its only flavour is the absence of choice? The pot is still warm. You've eaten, or you've scraped the bottom, or you've decided there wasn't enough left to eat at all. Either way, the fire is down to embers, and the pot stays close. Not for safety, not for convenience, but because that's where it always goes. That's where it's always been. In this time, boiling wasn't just cooking, it was culture. It was the answer to everything. No tools, boil. No ingredients, boil. No firewood for anything but a low flame, boil. You didn't question it. You didn't alter it. You didn't romanticize it. You just stirred, tasted, swallowed, and kept going. The meals you've eaten blend together. The same textures, the same temperatures, the same greyish-brown tint to everything. You don't remember what you ate last week, but you do remember when someone brought mushrooms, or when the pot cracked and everything spilled, or when someone boiled wild fennel and it turned the whole stew green. You remember that. You don't remember a feast, you remember a change. The Dark Ages didn't have cookbooks, but they had traditions, oral instructions, shared knowledge passed down like folk songs. Stir this until thick. Don't eat that root raw. Add water when it sticks. Feed the old first. These weren't recipes, they were rhythms. Domestic music in a world that had little else to keep. The pot was more than a tool. It was a calendar. You knew the season by what it smelled like. Turnips for winter, nettles for spring, lentils in drought years, barley when the harvest was good. The steam rising from the pot told you more than the sky did. And when people died, when the old slipped away in their sleep, the pot kept going. Someone else stirred it. Someone else dipped a spoon. Someone else learned that water could stretch flavour across another day. No one said thank you to the pot, but it carried them all. And so a people lived. Not well, not easily, but consistently, not with innovation, but with quiet repetition. A rhythm of boiling that never broke. A simplicity that fed generations. The rich had variety. Roasts, tarts, griddles and spice jars and servants to run the flames. They wrote letters about meals, hosted feasts, but most of the world, nearly all of it, boiled its food. Endlessly, reliably, without ceremony, without pause. And what did it leave behind? Not grand flavours, not menus, but stories of resilience. The pot told them how to survive, and they did, with little, with less, with heat, water and time. So the next time you pass by a simmering pot or feel steam on your face or taste something plain but warm, think of them. Not the kings, not the cooks in castle halls, but the quiet ones, the forgotten ones, the ones who boiled and fed and endured. And ask yourself, is it really the food we remember, or the way it made us feel when we had nothing else? It's Friday morning. The bell rings from the chapel, the baker opens late, and the butcher closed entirely. Because it's fish day. Again. You sigh. You already know what dinner will taste like. You smelled it yesterday. Salted cod soaking in a bucket near the hearth, cold and rubbery. You don't want it, but that's not the point. You eat fish on Fridays because the church says you must. But where did this rule come from? And why did it matter so much? In the early centuries of Christianity, fish wasn't about flavour. It was about discipline. Abstaining from meat was meant to show spiritual restraint, a way to mimic Christ's suffering, to practice humility, to turn the focus inward. Meat, warm-blooded and rich, was seen as indulgent, too satisfying, too sensual. Fish, on the other hand, was humbler, cleaner, closer to fasting. At first, this practice was loose, just recommended, but over time it hardened into law. By the early Middle Ages, Friday fish days were enforced across most of Christendom, not just for monks or the devout, but for everyone. Nobles, peasants, workers, lords, even kings. And it wasn't just Fridays. During Lent, during Advent, on Wednesdays, on the eves of holy days, the no-meat rules applied more often than not, which meant fish wasn't a special dish, it was just dinner. But here's the thing, most people didn't live near water. If you were inland, far from rivers, lakes or coastlines, fresh fish was rare. The only kind you saw came salted, dried, smoked, or worse, pickled in old brine that turned your stomach before it touched your tongue. It smelled like sour wool and boiled leather. But you ate it, because you had to. Salt cod was king, imported, rock hard, cured to the texture of wood. Before cooking it, you soaked it, then boiled it, then maybe fried it, if you could afford the fat. The smell lingered for days, on your hands, in your clothes, in the pot, and yet people depended on it, because fish days weren't optional. Breaking the fast was a sin. In some towns you could be fined, in monasteries punished, and in small villages shamed by neighbours who watched for meat smoke rising from chimneys on the wrong day. So entire economies adapted. Monasteries kept fish ponds, artificial lakes stocked with carp, eel and perch. Rivers were fished so heavily, laws had to be passed to protect the stocks. Markets filled with barrels of herring, stacked and salted. Boats sailed for weeks just to catch enough to keep up with demand. And prices, they soared. During Lent, fish became more expensive than pork. The poor were priced out. The rich had options: fresh trout, oysters, pike stewed in wine, flavoured with herbs and vinegar. But the labourer, he got grey cod. The city maid got sour pickled herring. The village widow might not get fish at all. She might boil cabbage and pretend, because the church didn't just tell you what to eat. It told you what kind of creature you were if you couldn't obey. And in a world where food already sucked, having one more rule to follow didn't make it easier. But how did something meant to humble the soul become a market full of profit? The smell hits before the market comes into view. Salt, brine, rot. The unmistakable tang of fish too long out of water. You pull your shawl tighter, not because you're cold, but because the wind carries the scent of Friday. You pass a fishmonger's stall. Slabs of grey cod hang like laundry. Barrels of herring glisten with oil and salt crystals. There are eels still twitching in wooden crates. A monk inspects a netted bag of dried smelts. A cook argues over the freshness of a trout. A child cries over the price of carp, and everywhere the question lingers. Is this holy? Because it's not about taste. It's not about preference. It's about compliance. Fish on Fridays isn't a culinary choice. It's a public ritual, a signal, a badge of obedience. In cities, the rule is easy to enforce. Monasteries monitor kitchens, parish priests sniff the air. Wealthy households signal their virtue with seafood feasts, poached salmon, pike in ginger sauce, trout roasted whole and served with lemon and saffron. These aren't sacrifices, they're performances. The church watches, but so do your neighbours. Break the rule, and it's not just God you offend, it's the village gossip, the merchant with the long memory, the steward who counts your purchases. Word spreads fast. And in a world where your soul's worth is measured in public virtue, one pot of meat stew could stain your name. So people got clever. Beaver tails, fish, that was the argument. They lived in water, had scales, kind of. Monks wrote long treatises explaining how aquatic behaviour made certain animals acceptable on fast days. Some stretched the logic until it broke. Seabirds, fish, frogs, technically amphibious. Whale meat, often counted. Otters, still debated. And then there were mock meats. Lent pies shaped like lamb legs, filled with lentils, herbs and dried fruits. Almond cheese pressed into rinds. Fish moulded to look like meat. Dishes disguised to follow the rule but still feel familiar. Not everyone approved. Some preachers railed against the excess. Fasting with indulgence is gluttony in disguise, they warned. But the people ignored them. They were tired, hungry, and if a clever cook could trick the mouth into forgetting what day it was, then so be it. But what about the poor? They couldn't afford fish, not even dried, not even salted to the point of bone. So they made do. Boiled onions, bread soaked in broth, pottage thickened with barley and leeks. They ate what they could, then apologised for what they couldn't, and hoped God understood. The church said the poor were held to a different standard, that fasting was about intent, but intent didn't fill the pot, and the rules still loomed. In the countryside, fish days were harder. No market, no boats, no rivers sometimes, just memory and guilt. A family would gather around a pot of peas and whisper apologies. No one spoke of the bacon rind floating under the surface. No one wanted to lie, but no one wanted to go to bed hungry either. And yet the fish trade flourished. Fish meant power. Monasteries that controlled ponds gained wealth. Merchants who sold herring grew rich. Kings who regulated trade wrote laws on fish with more care than laws on peace. There were fish taxes, fish tariffs, fish guilds, all built on the back of a rule about what not to eat. And so the question lingers. Was fish ever really about the soul? Or was it always about control? The rule stayed. Long after kings fell, long after villages turned into towns, long after people stopped believing they would be punished for breaking it, still the rule stayed. Friday came, and the meat went away. In some places, it was habit. In others, obligation. In others still, the rule had softened, but not disappeared. You could hear it in the questions whispered in kitchens across Europe. Is it Friday? Do we have fish? Can we just have eggs? The medieval world had many rules, but this one stuck harder than most. Not because it made sense, but because it was everywhere. It had become a rhythm, like the church bells, or the market day, or the prayer at dusk. A shape people lived inside, a rule that travelled with the calendar, the seasons, the tongue. It wasn't questioned much. It just was. And in that rule, a whole system bloomed. Trade routes for fish grew longer, rivers were dammed, coasts were fortified, salt production ramped up, fishing rights became valuable, taxed, disputed. You could make your fortune in herring, or ruin your village by losing access to the shore. Power shifted with the fish. The church profited too, not just in coin but in control. Every Friday was a quiet reminder that your plate belonged to something higher, that your hunger had a leash, that God was near, even in your kitchen. And for some, that felt comforting. For others, suffocating. Over time, the practice became less strict. By the late Middle Ages, fewer people observed it fully. Some cities looked the other way. Some priests quietly ignored violations. The Reformation fractured the rule even further. Protestant regions dropped it altogether. Catholic ones held on. A few monarchs even made it patriotic. Queen Elizabeth I in the 16th century famously encouraged fish eating, not for religion but to boost the English fishing industry. A fast not for the soul but for the navy. The rule had been repurposed. No longer just sacred, now also economic, political, practical, and still it lingered. Even today the echo remains, Fish Fridays in school cafeterias, Lent menus at fast food chains, quiet traditions in quiet homes, a rule whose roots were in penance, now served with tartar sauce and fries. But in the Middle Ages, it was never that casual. It was real, it was serious, it was enforced, and it shaped the lives of people who couldn't even read the rule, but still knew when to obey it. They learned the smell of fish meant Friday, that salt meant sanctity, that a dry cod hanging in the market was more than food, it was a law, a sermon, a schedule, And sometimes in the middle of a grey winter evening, when the fire smoked and the pot boiled over and the dried herring stank of old sea and mouldy brine, someone would wonder, was this what holiness was supposed to taste like? Because for the ordinary people, the ones who had no feast to follow, no spices to hide the flavour, no wine to wash it down, fish wasn't sacred. It was just another hard thing they did. To be good, to be counted, to be faithful. And so they ate it, again and again, quietly, dutifully, even when it sucked. You sit cross-legged on a cold stone bench. The clay bowl in front of you steams faintly. It's not a feast, it's not a celebration, it's just dinner. And in Sparta, dinner is a duty. You pick up the bowl, you know what's inside, you've eaten it every day since you were 7. It's black soup, melas zomos, a murky, oily mixture of pork broth, vinegar and blood. It smells sharp, metallic, like rusted iron dropped into boiled onions. The texture is thin, but the taste is thick with salt and sourness. You drink it, and you try not to grimace, because in Sparta, food isn't for pleasure, it's for discipline. The Spartan way of life was built on toughness, on restraint, on training the body by denying its softness. And that didn't stop at the barracks. It extended to the plate, especially to the black soup. According to legend, Spartan boys entered military life at age 7, taken from their homes, thrown into the agoge, the state-run training system. They learned to fight, to march, to survive, but they also learned to eat what was given, without complaint, without comment. And what they were given was usually this: black soup, made from pork meat boiled down with vinegar, salt and fresh pig's blood. Sometimes it had garlic, maybe a shred of wild herb, never enough to change the colour. The soup remained dark, bitter, intentionally unpleasant. It wasn't just food, it was philosophy in a bowl. Because to enjoy food too much was to indulge, and indulgence in Sparta was weakness. Other Greeks, especially those from Athens, mocked this. They had wine-sweetened cakes, grilled fish, fruits, soaked in honey. The Athenians believed in beauty and balance, even in their meals. The Spartans believed in endurance. There's an old story of a visitor from another city who tried the black soup. He choked, grimaced, and told his host, "Now I understand why Spartans have no fear of death." It was a joke, but only just. In Sparta, meals weren't private. They were eaten in common mess halls, syssitia, shared among soldiers and youth. Everyone was expected to contribute food to the group pot, especially black soup. If you couldn't pay your share, you couldn't join the table. And if you couldn't join the table, you weren't fully Spartan. You were expected to suffer through every sip with dignity. So the soup became a test of loyalty, of stoicism, of your ability to chew past revulsion. And maybe the strangest part? The Spartans liked that it was bad. They were proud of it. Proud of their rejection of flavour. Proud that they didn't season, didn't bake, didn't fry. Proud that what they ate was barely food, because it proved they didn't need comfort. Just calories. But what happens to a culture when survival is the only seasoning? The bowl is empty now. You scraped it clean as always. Not out of hunger, black soup doesn't make you crave more, but out of habit. In Sparta, you never waste food. You never ask for seconds. You eat because it's there, not because you want to. And if you did want something more, something sweeter, softer, warmer, you never say it aloud. That's not the Spartan way. The syssitia, the public mess, isn't just a dining hall. It's an institution. Every male Spartan, once accepted, must eat here, every day, from adolescence through adulthood. Warriors, elders, kings, all equal at the table, bound by broth. Food is rationed, strict, boring, functional. It's not meant to inspire, it's meant to remind you of your place. If you're late, there's no meal. If you're disrespectful, there's no place. And if you can't contribute pork, vinegar or bread, you're shamed, or worse, removed. Because sharing the soup isn't just about eating, it's about belonging. The black soup itself becomes a kind of ritual. Each day you drink the same foul liquid, and each day you prove that you can, that you're strong, that your body doesn't rebel. that your face doesn't wince, because to wince would be to suggest that food could matter, and Spartans were taught that food should never matter. Even outside the mess halls, food was seen as a tool for control. Spartan boys were deliberately underfed, not to starve them, but to train them, to force them to think like survivors. They were allowed, expected to steal food. But if caught, they were punished, not for the theft, but for the failure. The lesson was simple: learn how to take what you need, learn how to hide what you have, and how to suffer in silence. This philosophy extended beyond soup. Spartan meals were almost always boiled. Boiled barley, boiled onions, boiled greens, no frying, no roasting, no spice. Even bread was dense and plain. No oils, no honey. The palate was denied the joy of contrast, because contrast was indulgence, and indulgence made you soft. The elite of Sparta ate the same as the common soldier. There were no lavish feasts, no banquets. Even kings sat at the same tables, sipped the same soup. This was meant to show unity, to reinforce that the city's strength came from discipline, not decadence. But not everyone followed the rules. The helots, Sparta's enslaved underclass, did most of the cooking, most of the farming, most of the actual labour. They had their own food, simpler still sometimes, but occasionally more flavourful. Their barley was ground coarser. Their stews were cooked longer. They had no obligation to black soup, only to make it. And when rebellion stirred, and they did often, said some Spartans blamed the stew. That living without taste for too long made a man forget empathy. Still the tradition held. Centuries passed. Black soup became a symbol, a shorthand for Spartan resolve. When other Greek cities told stories of luxury, Sparta told stories of suffering. Of men who marched for days without food. Of warriors who fought on empty stomachs. Of soldiers who drank blood and vinegar and called it strength. But how much character can a culture build on something no one actually enjoys? The fire under the pot is low now. The last bowl has been served. The last spoon scraped. The stone floor of the Sicycian is swept. And in the quiet warmth of the coals, the thick iron pot still simmers, black, oily, bitter. Sparta's most enduring dish. Long after the battles ended, long after the city crumbled, the legend of black soup lived on. Not because it tasted good, not because it changed cooking, but because it proved something Spartans were proud of, even if no one else understood. It proved that they could endure. They didn't want food to comfort. They wanted it to toughen. They didn't want to celebrate flavour. They wanted to despise it, to swallow pain, to chew disappointment, to train the body to submit. And that's what black soup did. It wasn't just unpleasant. It was designed to be unpleasant. The vinegar stung, the blood metallic. The pork boiled so long it lost all joy. It was food stripped of food's very purpose. It made you eat and hate and endure over and over again, did it? But strength, real strength, asks something else. It asks whether survival alone is enough, whether rejecting pleasure for its own sake creates something stronger, or simply something harder. The Spartans left behind no cookbooks, no treasured family recipes, no secrets passed down except through stories. And those stories always end the same way. The soup was bad, but they drank it anyway. Today no one makes black soup by choice. Chefs have tried. Historians have recreated it, but it always comes back the same. Sour, greasy, grim. A flavour you remember not with nostalgia but with a grimace. And that's the point. It was never meant to be remembered on the tongue, just in the spine. The truth is, most of us don't live like Spartans. We don't want to. We like warm bread, we like herbs, we like to smile when we eat. But for a brief moment in history, an entire society chose to prove its worth through a bowl of blood and vinegar. Not because it fed them, but because it didn't. So the next time you taste something bland, something watery, something that feels more punishment than pleasure, think of Sparta. Think of a people who believed weakness could be boiled away. And ask yourself, is food still food when it's only there to make you suffer? You smell the smoke before you hear the shouting. It's not the kind of smoke from your oven, the comforting scent of rising dough and scorched flour. No, this smoke is darker, oily, rising from burning crates, overturned carts, and the first broken window of the baker's shop down the lane. You wipe your hands on your apron. The dough you were kneading sits forgotten. The line outside your shop has dissolved into a crowd that's no longer waiting. It's demanding. It's the summer of 1740-something. You're a baker, and today the price of bread has finally pushed the people too far. Bread isn't just breakfast here, it's survival. It makes up the majority of what working families eat. Every day, every meal, porridge in the morning, bread at noon, crusts with broth at night. Without bread, there is nothing. So when the cost of flour rises, even by a little, people notice. They watch the scales at the market. They whisper about sacks being hidden, loaves getting smaller, prices inching up while the weights stay the same. They measure their meals in coin and dust. And when the loaves are too light or too expensive, they riot. Flour towns, they called them. Places where the price of grain ruled everything. Paris, Lyon, Bristol, Naples, Vienna. Cities where the baker's oven could turn a crowd violent, where a shortage of bread could bring an entire district to a standstill. The pattern was always the same. First, rumours. Someone says the millers are hoarding flour. Someone else says the grain shipments were bought up by speculators. Someone blames the government. Someone blames the nobles. Someone blames the bakers. Then, lines, long ones, women, mostly, boy, holding coins, holding baskets, holding children, waiting for hours for a loaf, watching the supply run out. Then, noise, the sound of fists on doors, of shouting, of rocks against shutters. Then, fire, because in a world where bread is the centre of life, not having it feels like betrayal. The people expect stability. Bread is supposed to be steady, sacred, controlled, not something that plays by the rules of the market. So they take control themselves, they storm the shops, they seize the loaves, they overturn carts. Sometimes they hang signs reading bread or blood. Sometimes they hang the bakers. You've seen this before, maybe not here, but nearby. Last winter, 2 towns over, a mob forced the bakers to sell all their bread at just prices. Not market prices, fair prices. Prices they shouted out in the square, fists raised. No one stopped them, not the guards, not the mayor. Because bread riots aren't just crime, they're a protest. And you, as the baker, are always caught in between. You're not rich, flour is expensive for you too. The mill charges more, the transport costs rise, the taxes bite. You make the bread, but you don't set the rules. Still they see you as part of the machine. So when the windows break, you don't fight back. You step away from the oven. You step back from the door and you wonder, how did something so basic become dangerous? The fire didn't spread far. The mob burned a few carts, looted a granary and smashed open a bakery window with a paving stone. But by morning the streets are quiet again. Ash in the gutters, soot on your shutters. And a crowd gathered near the chapel waiting for the magistrate to speak. He'll talk about order, about justice, about protecting property, but he won't talk about hunger, because that's what started it, what always starts it. Not anger, not politics, just hunger. Bread is more than food, it's a promise, a contract between the people and the system. You don't need much, just enough to keep going. So when that promise breaks, when the crusts get thinner, when the baker's shelves are empty, people don't feel disappointed. They feel betrayed. And in 18th century Europe, that betrayal turned into riot. Not revolution yet, but something close. A warning, a pressure release, a scream in the form of broken glass and scattered flour. These riots weren't random, they followed grain shortages. Failed harvests, bad winters, rising tariffs, corrupt millers. Wealthy landowners exporting grain while locals starved. People saw the wagons full of wheat heading towards city gates, and they stopped them, intercepted them. In France, women led many of these protests. Mothers, wives, widows. Bread wasn't an idea for them, it was what stood between life and death for their children. They banged pots, blocked bridges, stood in the cold and demanded flour be sold at a just price, not a market price. Fairness mattered more than legality. In England, similar unrest took place in places like Bristol and Norwich. Moral economy, they called it later. An idea that the community had a right to food, a right to fairness, a right to control a market that ignored their hunger. You, the baker, are still caught in the middle. You know both sides. You know what it costs to get flour. You know what it feels like to underbake a loaf because the woodpile is nearly gone. You know what it feels like to look at a line of desperate faces and say, I have nothing left. And you know what it's like to have a stone come through your window anyway. The government often sides with merchants, with profit, with grain traders who store wheat in silos and wait for the price to rise. That's legal, but it feels cruel. And when laws protect profits instead of people, people make their own laws. They write them in chalk on bakery walls. They chant them in the square. They shout them through smoke. Bread riots don't last long, but they echo. They show how fragile the system really is. How a single missing shipment can tilt a city off balance. How a baker's shop can become a target. How food, quiet, simple food, can carry the weight of revolution. You rebuild your window, sweep the broken glass, recover the oven bricks. You bake again. But something has changed. Now, every loaf you sell feels like a calculation. Too light and someone will accuse you. Too expensive and someone might remember your name. But what do you do when fairness is demanded by fire? The ovens are hot again. You're baking. The rhythm is familiar. Knead, fold, shape, bake. The smell of fresh bread cuts through the soot in the air. People return slowly. Coins in hand, eyes on the scale. They don't speak much, neither do you. Everyone is waiting to see if this time will hold. Because even though the riot is over, the hunger isn't. The grain stores are still low, the prices are still high, and the people are still watching the scales, the shelves, the sky. Because everyone knows one bad harvest, one closed road, one greedy merchant, and it begins again. Governments knew this too. That's why some monarchs kept grain reserves. Stockpiles hidden beneath city halls, emergency flour rations locked in barrels behind guarded doors. They knew that when bread vanished, so did peace. Bread wasn't just calories, it was politics, it was safety, it was order. And when that order cracked, the sound echoed far. Some riots faded, others sparked greater unrest. In pre-revolutionary France, grain shortages led to dozens of flour riots. People raided mills, burned tax records, demanded justice in the form of crust and crumb. Bakers were harassed. Governors fled, priests preached calm, but the loaves stayed thin. Then came 1789. The streets of Paris surged again, not just with cries for liberty, but with the same old chant that had rung out in every flour town for generations. Bread, bread, bread. The French Revolution didn't begin with ideas alone. It began with empty stomachs, with mothers who couldn't feed their children, with bakeries smashed open and granaries looted, with whispers that Marie Antoinette had said, "Let them eat cake." A story not entirely true, but one that captured the fury of the people who had none. In that moment, bread became a symbol, not just of food, but of dignity. And the baker, still caught in the middle, still waking before dawn, still covered in flour, still trying to stretch dough thin enough to feed the crowd and thick enough to stay safe. Centuries later, we rarely think of bakers as revolutionaries. We rarely think of loaves as political. But in the world of flour towns, every roll, every stale, every crust was a line between silence and riot. Bread was supposed to be boring, but it never stayed that way for long. And now, when you hold a slice of bread in your hand, soft, warm, easy, you might not remember the riots, the flames, the prices scrawled in chalk, but they're all there, baked into every loaf, and it's worth asking, how close are we to the edge when the only thing that kept the peace was bread? You hear it in the silence, the kind of silence that only comes when thousands of people hold their breath. The markets are closed, the wells are guarded, the gates are locked and bolted from within, and no one is coming in or going out. You're under siege.